Today we're going to take a turn away from the stories about feuds, strikes, and disasters that we've shared over the last few months to tell you a more positive tale. It's about a Kentucky musician loved by millions of people, not just in this part of the country, but all over the world. The mother of folk, Jean Ritchie. And her story is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Growing up, Steve, I had never heard of Jean Ritchie until a little bit later, and I started getting into my teens, and I found out this woman was a worldwide sensation. There were a lot of people that just would think, oh, they're just local. It's sort of that same way of when we talk about bluegrass. You know, bluegrass is popular here, but you go to some countries, Japan, you go to some other places, Germany, oh my gosh, they are head over heels when it comes to bluegrass music. But Jean Ritchie, mother of folk, had an instrument, a dulcimer, that could just talk like it was another voice.
Yeah, indeed. And buddy, she is loved. You know, we've talked about her some on our Facebook page, and anytime we post about Jean Ritchie, I mean, we get tens of thousands of people that come and like that and make comments and all that, and they're all, every last one of them, very positive about her. She is, as I said, very well loved. But, you know, she wasn't just a bluegrass singer, which Dulcimer is sort of bluegrass. She's a folk singer. She was a songwriter. As Rod said, she was an Appalachian dulcimer player, and she was a keeper of hundreds of songs passed down through her family. In her lifetime, she inspired countless musicians, from Bob Dylan to Johnny Cash and beyond. And it all started in the mountains of eastern Kentucky in a little place called Viper. Now, Jean Ritchie was born there on December 8, 1922, into a family that quite literally sang their way through life. Her parents, Abigail and Ballads Ritchie, raised 14 children, Jean the youngest of the bunch, and their home was filled with sounds of music.
Well, 10 of those kids were girls, all packed into one bedroom in their farmhouse. The Ritchies didn't have a radio either, so making their own music was how they entertained themselves. They sang while they worked, gathered around in the evenings to harmonize, and also carried a literal treasure trove of old traditional songs in their heads. And what a treasure those songs were. The Ritchies, now get this, knew over 300 songs, many of them which were centuries-old British and Irish ballads that had traveled to Appalachia with their ancestors. Now, for those of you who don't know, these songs, called the Child Ballads, are named after Francis James Child, a scholar who documented these traditional British and Scottish folk songs. But here's the thing. In Appalachia, these songs evolved into something more. They took on a life, telling of the experiences of folks living in the mountains.
Now, Ballads Ritchie was a dulcimer player. While he preferred playing to singing, he still loved those old ballads. And get this, Rod, back in 1910 or 1911, Mr. Ritchie even printed a book of songs called Lover's Melodies, which included some of the most popular tunes in eastern Kentucky at the time, a sort of greatest hits of old-time Appalachian music, if you will. And it wasn't just him. Jean's older siblings were just as immersed in that music. In fact, in 1917, a British folk song collector named Cecil Sharp traveled to Kentucky and collected songs from Jean's sisters, May and Una, those old songs from Appalachia ending up in Sharp's notebooks, preserved for generations. The Ritchie family, though, wasn't just any family of singers. They were a part of a larger tradition of Appalachian ballad singing families, like the Combs family from nearby Knott County. And the Ritchies trace their roots all the way back to Scotland.
That's right, Steve. Jean's ancestors on her father's side came from Stewarton in East Ayrshire, Scotland, and settled in Kentucky after the Revolutionary War. Her great-great-grandfather, Alexander Crockett Ritchie, stayed in the mountains while the rest of the family moved back to Virginia. And the Ritchies' ties to these mountains were strong, even during the Civil War, when most of the family fought on the Confederate side. Well, by the time that Jean Ritchie came along, music and storytelling were as natural to the family as breathing. And as for her, The music wasn't just something to enjoy. It became her life work. She had a way of preserving these songs while also making them her own.
Well, Jean Ritchie grew up in Viper, surrounded by music and mountains, but she was also incredibly smart. After graduating high school, she went on to study at Cumberland Junior College and later earned a degree in social work from the University of Kentucky in 1946. But even as she pursued her education and then moved to New York, she stayed connected to her Appalachian roots. During college, she was active in the Glee Club and choir, but also learned to play the piano, which broadened her musical knowledge. She was once told by another famous folk music collector that she couldn't be considered a quote-unquote real folk singer because she'd been to college. Well, instead of being insulted, Jean Ritchie took that as a compliment.
Well, Steve, after graduating, Jean moved to New York City to work as a social worker at the Henry Street Settlement. And it was there, of all places, that her Appalachian songs caught the attention of folks in the city. There, she met legends like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Alan Lomax, all of whom were part of the folk revival movement of the time. To them, Jean represented the authentic Appalachian tradition. She was the real deal. She wasn't just singing old songs. She was living proof of the rich musical heritage of the mountains. Jean also played the Appalachian Dulcimer, an instrument that was almost forgotten before she brought it back into the spotlight. And she later popularized the Dulcimer by including it on her albums and writing books on how to play it. It became her signature, and to this day, the Dulcimer is practically synonymous with that Jean Ritchie.
And Rod, in 1948, she performed at the Spring Fever Hootenanny, sharing the stage with none other than the Weavers and Woody Guthrie, folk legends. By 1949, Jean Ritchie was making regular appearances on Oscar Brand's Folk Song Festival radio show on WNYC Radio in New York. Around the same time, she also started recording songs, stories, and oral histories with Alan Lomax, one of the most influential figures in preserving folk music. Lomax captured hours of Jean singing and talking about the songs she grew up with, and the recordings are now part of the Lomax Digital Archive, so anyone can listen to that piece of music history. And if that wasn't enough, in 1951, Jean was recorded extensively for the Library of Congress, furthering her role in the preservation of Appalachian music. How about that?
In that same year, she became a full-time musician, song collector, and songwriter. She signed with, of all record labels, seriously, Elektra Records, and in 1952 released her first album singing the traditional songs of her Kentucky mountain family. Now, the reason why I made such a big deal over Elektra Records, gosh, they've released a lot of records for a lot of popular groups and individuals over the years, and Jean Ritchie was signed to that label in 1952. Well, that album she recorded, including Ritchie's family versions of songs like Gypsum Davy, The Cuckoo, and The Little Devils. One of the songs that had fascinated Cecil Sharp back in 1917 when he first heard it from one of Jean's sisters. The album quickly caught on with the folk music listeners who enjoyed the way that Jean Ritchie shared these songs in a way that felt most authentic and, yes, deeply personal.
And in 1952, she was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship, a big honor, to trace the connections between ballads she grew up singing in Viper and their British, Scottish, and Irish roots. Jean and her husband spent 18 months traveling through the UK and Ireland, recording, interviewing, and photographing singers. They worked with legendary figures like Elizabeth Cronin, Tommy and Sarah Macomb, Jeannie Robertson, and Seamus Ennis. Her method of finding these song connections was simple but effective. You see, whenever she'd meet someone, she'd ask if they knew a song like Barbara Allen, and she'd sing a few verses.
And the results became a new recording. In 1954, Jean released her album Field Trip, aptly titled, featuring British and Irish recordings side by side with Ritchie family versions of the same songs. Well, later, Folkways issued two more albums, Field Trip England in 1959 and as I roved out Field Trip Ireland in 1960. Well, not only that, but Jean's experiences overseas led to a book, From Fair to Fair, Folk Songs of the British Isles, published in 1966. It included transcriptions and photos from her journey, capturing the spirit of these folk traditions. But her trip to Britain wasn't just about collecting songs, though. She was sharing her own music with a whole new audience. She performed at concerts for the English Folk Dance and Song Society, and yes, she even sang at the annual Royal Albert Hall Festival.
Wow. Well, after returning to the U.S., Ms. Ritchie continued to make waves in the folk world. In 1955, she wrote Singing Family of the Cumberlands, a book that documented how her family used music in their everyday lives, from work songs to ballads sung on the porch. It's still used in schools today to teach about Appalachian culture. She also popularized hymns like Amazing Grace and Brightest and the Best. And she recorded on her 1959 album, Jean Ritchie Interviews Her Family, with documentary recordings.
Well, she had a role at the first, now you're going to probably know the name, folks, when I say it, the Newport Folk Festival. It's world famous in 1959. That's when she had that role. She directed and performed there and later served on the first folklore panel for the National Endowment for the Arts. Her 1961 album, Ballads from Her Appalachian Family Tradition, included some of the most iconic child ballads, Barbary Allen, Two Sisters, and Hangman, just to name a few. In 1963, she recorded an album with Doc Watson called Jean Ritchie and Doc Watson, live at Folk City. Now, one of the songs that was from that record was called Shady Grove. Now, Doc Watson is often credited with popularizing that song, but did you know he most likely learned it from Jean? And Jean, in turn, learned it from her father, Ballads Ritchie.
Well, by the 1960s, the folk music world was changing. Instead of traditional tunes, protest songs were taking center stage, such as Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind. While Jean largely stayed focused on traditional ballads, she too began writing original songs with powerful social and political themes, many based on her own experiences growing up in eastern Kentucky. Her life there inspired songs about the environmental damage caused by coal mining and logging. Tracks like Blue Diamond Mines, Black Waters, and the L&N Don't Stop Here Anymore tackled issues like strip mining and the economic struggles that we've all faced here in Appalachia. It even caught the attention of none other than Johnny Cash, who recorded that song about the L&N after hearing his wife, June Carter Cash, sing it. But Jean used another name, Fan Hall, when she wrote her mining songs, for two reasons. First, and most importantly, she was worried that her mother might disapprove of her political themes. Second, she thought the songs might be taken a little bit more seriously if folks assumed that a man had written them instead of her.
Despite the new songs Jean Ritchie wrote under the Fan Hall name, she stayed connected to her roots. Her 50th anniversary album, Mountain Born, released in 1995, features her sons, Peter and Jonathan. And in 1996, Kentucky Educational Television honored her with a documentary called Mountain Born, The Jean Ritchie Story. Beyond her writing and recording, though, one thing is synonymous with her, the dulcimer. This instrument, with its soft and ethereal sound, had been a part of Appalachian music for generations, but it was almost forgotten outside the mountains. Jean Ritchie brought the dulcimer back into the spotlight. While her father played the dulcimer when Jean was a child, he didn't allow her or any of the siblings to touch it. Of course, Jean snuck a few strums in there anyway, and by the time that he decided to teach her, she'd already figured it out on her own. He called her a natural-born musician. In the late 1940s, Jean's dulcimer playing became a hallmark of her style.
Her husband, George Pickow, even built her a dulcimer as a gift. That simple gesture turned into a business when George's uncle, Morris, helped them set up a workshop in Brooklyn, where they finished and sold hundreds of dulcimers. At first, they worked with Jethro Ambergy, a relative of Jean's from Kentucky, who shipped them unfinished dulcimers. Well, George and Jean would then finish them up, tune them, and then sell them. Eventually, they made the instruments entirely on their own and sold hundreds of dulcimers. Jean also wrote the Dulcimer book in 1974, and get this, Rod, fans kept asking her, which album has the most dulcimer? So, in 1984, she recorded, yes, the most dulcimers, an album where the dulcimer featured on every single track. By the 1970s and 1980s, folk musicians on both sides of the Atlantic were picking up dulcimers thanks to Jean Ritchie's influence.
Over her lifetime, though, Jean Ritchie received numerous awards in recognition of her life's work. She won the Folk Alliance Lifetime Achievement Award in 1998, and in 2002, she was awarded the National Heritage Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Arts, one of the highest honors for folk artists in the United States. She passed away on June 1st, 2015, at the age of 92, marking the end of an extraordinary chapter in American folk music.
Wow. I'm telling you what, this is a very interesting story. And the reason we kind of got to this, beyond the fact that I've been wanting to tell her story for actually a couple of years now, happens to go with a listener who left a comment on our YouTube page saying that he wasn't sure, but he thought he had only heard one story that we'd done that somebody wasn't, quote unquote, unalived. So I got looking at that and thinking, yeah, we've been doing some pretty deeply mean stories lately. So I thought this would be a good time to tell a positive story,
Well, and it's also kind of ironic, too, that we're recording this after the release of that biopic that they just did on Bob Dylan. That came out at Christmas, and, we're learning more about Bob Dylan and where he got a lot of his musical style, and now some other stories are starting to come out. Of course, Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan, and I was just reading today of a story of Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson when Chris Christopherson was working as a janitor in the Columbia Records studio. Yeah. And he insisted on Christopherson being in there to contribute. And, the rest is kind of history from that point on. But, Jean Ritchie influenced so many people that, we're just scratching the surface here with a lot of these people. And, you mentioned some names, and I still think of Edward Norton, who's in this Bob Dylan biopic that's out, playing Pete Seeger. And he's playing Pete Seeger pretty darn good from what I can remember of, old film and old video of Pete Seeger when he was talking and different things. But, all these people have at one point or another been influenced by Jean Ritchie and her love of music and the way that she learned mountain, Appalachian, Irish, Scottish music, however you want to call it.
Yeah, and she could have easily gone a whole different direction. That's just plain bluegrass. It's interesting that there are two threads that came out of the Appalachian tradition, this folk style that she did, and then the bluegrass from people like the Stanley Brothers,
right,
and others as well. So, we have a rich tradition for music here in Appalachia, and it's really good that we can share at least this particular story for you.
Yep.
And that story is the story of Jean Ritchie, the girl from Viper, Kentucky, who shared her family's love for the music they'd been raised on with the world. It's another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast, the audio version, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching us on YouTube, heaven help you, but you can click the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and leave us a comment. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.